We are going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 this morning. A lot of times on this particular Sunday, at this time of year, in churches I've been in, the preacher has preached some sort of, Thanksgiving message because we just celebrated Thanksgiving. And so preach something like that. And this is not quite a Thanksgiving message. This is also in the historic church calendar. This is the first Sunday of Advent. So some churches will preach an Advent message, and they usually traditionally the first Sunday of Advent is about waiting and hope and all of that. This is not a traditional Advent message either. So I'm bucking with tradition. I'm not doing Thanksgiving and I'm not doing Advent, but the passage we're going to look at has everything to do with both Thanksgiving and hope and waiting. And so even though it's not formally and traditionally that, I think this passage actually helps us understand, if we pay attention to it, how it is we can live with gratitude and joy constantly, and what in the world we're actually hoping for. All right? And so, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and to get that started, I want to introduce you to somebody who's very special to me. If we can put this first picture up. This is Wes. He is my grandson. He's 18 months old. This was actually just a couple weeks ago, this picture was taken at his two cousins' birthday party, because he's got a 4-year-old cousin and a 2-year-old cousin. This was their birthday party a couple weeks ago, and Wes is pretty cute. Right? I can say that because I'm grandpa and I'm a little bit biased. Wes is a big fan of Papa. That would be me. First thing that happens, he's not even out of the car at our house, and it's Papa, Papa, Papa. So he's a big fan of Papa, and Papa's a fairly big fan of Wes. He's 18 months old. So this is why this is important. Wes has just recently learned the power of the sigh. It works like this. Wes, it's time to go. Can you go get your tennis shoes so we can put them on? Wes, if you want to go outside, we need to put your jacket on. Can you go get your jacket? It's such hard work getting your shoes and your jacket, isn't it? Not only does it come with a sigh, but being 18 months old, it also comes with throwing yourself down on the ground and sighing. But because Wes is my grandson, he's quite smart. And so when he throws himself down on the ground, he doesn't do it aggressively because he might hurt himself. So it's... And then, so Wes has learned that life is hard. You get asked to do things you don't feel like doing, and you got to throw yourself slowly on the ground, and you got to sigh and let everyone know that, man, this is really, really, really tough. Life is hard. Yes. It is. Unfortunately, Eric knows that this morning. Things did not go so well in the football game for him yesterday. I mean, when you're up 31-10 with 4 minutes to go in the third quarter and you end up losing 38-34, life is hard. I heard there was an elephant in the room and we just need to get it out there so we all know we can still talk to you. Right? Life is hard. I mean, hey, maybe it's not just Eric. I don't know if we have any Ohio State fans in the room. 2 years in a row you lose to Michigan and you get totally thumped yesterday when you're supposed to be the number 2 team in the nation. I mean, it's hard. Life's hard. Beyond simple things like football or picking up your coat or your tennis shoes, I mean, in reality, there are things in life that make it challenging, right? True? I bumped into some friends that we typically only see once or twice a year at some mutual friends' 50th wedding anniversary here recently. How have you been? Hadn't seen them for 10 months. How have you been? It's been a really, really hard year. Why? Because 7 people we know, not just casually know, either family members or our closest friends, have gone through messy, ugly, painful divorces in the last 10 months. It's not uncommon to meet people who have a family member, a loved one in the hospital, and the prognosis isn't good. True? Sometimes it's just disappointment with family relationships, disappointment with the choices your adult children are making. Sometimes it's complete breakdown of friendships. Like, life does not always go the way we want. It doesn't mean it's all bad, but it's not always all good either. True? This passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul provides sort of his own personal testimony with that experience, and then gives us a way to look at our life and look at not just the good things, but even the bad things too, and how we can live in such a way that we can live with courage and confidence and even gratitude and joy in the face of the fact that life isn't always easy. And so let's jump in. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1 says this. Therefore, notice he's building off of what he said before, where he talked about the glory of his ministry. Therefore, since we have this ministry, as we've received mercy, we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. And he's actually going to come back to that phrase in verse 16 and say it again. We don't lose heart. And so a major purpose of what he's writing in 2 Corinthians 4 is to help us understand why it is that he doesn't lose heart even when life is hard. And at the time Paul writes this, he's been following Jesus for about 20 years. He's been serving him for most of that time. Certainly he's had some incredible spiritual experiences, like stuff you and I will never experience. He's seen some incredible things in ministry. He's been a part of watching God work through him and through people he's raised up in the faith. He's seen some victories, but he's also experienced some incredible difficulties in those 20 years. And he's going to mention kind of some general categories here in a little bit, but he's had enough years of walking with Jesus and enough tread on the wheels of his life to know that there are things that make you want to just quit. Toss in the towel, say I'm done with this doesn't make sense. Sure, maybe I won't cash in my chips on Jesus, but I'm just going to go to the back row and I'm just going to sit and coast and be done with it all. I'm tired of doing this, right? Like he's lived enough life and followed Jesus long enough to know it's not always easy. It's possible to quit and lose heart, but he says we don't. We don't lose heart. And some of you, depending where you're at in life, you may have had enough wear on the tires of your life too to know that, man, it did not go the way I expected. There were some things that came along that were hard. Some of you, maybe even at a young age, were like, I did not see that one coming. I thought I was going to, and now it turned out like... I thought this was my career path, and that crashed and burned, right? Like, we do not lose heart. And the question then for Paul is, why? Because sometimes I want to. Why not? Well, that's what Paul's going to answer in this chapter. Why doesn't he lose heart? And so what he does is he begins to kind of summarize his ministry and summarize people's interaction with his ministry. And then out of that, he begins to offer how he looks at his life, how he looks at his ministry, how he looks at following Jesus that enables him not to lose heart. So let's jump down to verse 5. He says this in verse 5. He says, "For here's what his life is all about. Here's how he like the chief content of his life. For we don't preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord." Like, as he goes about his ministry, it's not about me. Paul's like, yes, I'm an apostle, but I'm not trying to advance my career as an apostle. I'm not trying to promote myself. I want everyone to remember me. It's not like, here, you need to know who Paul is. He's not trying to grow his Instagram following, his Twitter following, right? And look, we say that, and we know that's silly. But we like impressive people, don't we? We like impressive people. When you're young, you're naive enough to not try to hide that. When you're old, you still believe it. You just try to cover it up because you know it's not right anymore. The reason I say that is my daughter-in-law is a 6th grade teacher at a Christian school. She had one of her 6th graders the other day say, "You should listen to this pastor. He's got thousands and thousands of followers on Instagram." We like those kind of people. We think they're impressive. But Paul's like, I don't preach myself. I'm not the Lord. I'm not the one I'm promoting. I'm not the one I want people to know. I'm not the one I want people to remember. We don't preach ourselves as Lord, but Christ Jesus is Lord. And how does Paul view himself? And ourselves as your bondservants. Doulos in Greek, which means slave. Like, we're your slave. That's how I think about myself, right? That's what Paul's saying. Like, as a follower of Jesus, my job is to serve you and help you get to know Jesus and help you follow Jesus. So should I be forgotten and Jesus be remembered? That's all that really matters to me. Because we preach him as Lord and ourselves as bondservants on account of Jesus. 4 verse 6, God who said, light shall shine out of darkness. Way back in Genesis chapter 1, let there be light, right? The God who said that is the same one who has shown in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Paul's like, this is what I carry around as I go about my life. I carry the light of the glory of God in the face of Christ. That's the content of my life. That's what I want people to experience when I interact with them. That's what I want them to remember about me, is that I shone forth the light of Jesus. That's what my life is all about. And so that's the chief content of his life. Now, the reality is, in Paul's world, and even in our world, people don't always like the light. Or sometimes, trying to live for the light and make that the content of your life, that forces you to kind of go against the grain, climb uphill, take stands on things that people may look down on you. It just may make life harder, right? Following Jesus life itself can be hard. Following Jesus can actually make it more difficult. But Paul says that's what our life is about. And then he says this in verse 7. But, we have this glory of Jesus in the face of Christ. We're caring about this glory. But why does it look so inglorious, Paul? Well, here's why. But we have this treasure of the light of the glory of God in the face of Christ. We have this treasure in earthen containers, earthen vessels. Some translations, jars of clay. We have this treasure in jars of clay. Take a look at this picture if we can just... this is a clay jar found in the city of Corinth. That's who Paul is writing to. They were everywhere. This is just common dishware, right? In Paul's world. A jar of clay was just made out of the stuff of the earth, right? And Paul's like, that's me. That's us. We're just like a jar. Now, some of those jars could be quite pretty. I imagine this one in its prime probably looked pretty good, right? In its prime. But then it gets used, and it gets nicked, and it gets chipped, and the paint fades, and it gets dinged up. And not only that, earthenware, as anyone who's ever tried to plant in a terracotta pot knows, that you drop that thing, what happens? It just shatters. This is a secret. Hopefully my wife does not listen to this, all right? I ordered a ceramic bowl that my wife wanted for Christmas on Target online. It wasn't available in stores. I had to get a Target account to order this thing. I ordered it. Showed up yesterday in about 15 pieces. They didn't even put any padding in it. They literally just threw it in an empty box. That's the way earthenware jars work. Doesn't take much to break them, and that's Paul's point. We have this glory of God, this treasure of the glorious face of God that shows up in Christ, and yet we're carrying it about in these vulnerable, frail, fragile earthenware jars called ourselves. And we might have looked good in our prime prime might be past. Maybe you're still in your prime and you look good, but guess what? You're still frail and fragile, and you never know what could happen. A student of my daughter-in-law's from last year just died unexpectedly at 11 years old. No warning. They're still not 100% certain why. Earthenware jars are frail and vulnerable and fragile. And that's what we are. We have this treasure of the glory of Christ in earthenware jars, and therefore it doesn't always look very glorious. But that's not bad. Look what Paul says. He says, we have this treasure in earthen containers so that, here's the purpose, so that the extraordinary greatness of the power will be from God and not ourselves. Like, we carry it about in these vulnerable, fragile jars so that when people are impressed, they're not impressed with us. They're impressed with Jesus. They're impressed with the glory of God. They're impressed with what God did in Jesus, not in us. And so we carry it about so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be from God and not from ourselves. And then Paul lists off some of the things that trying to follow Jesus has led to in his life that would have made it easy for him to lose heart. Look what he says in verse 8. We're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Like, there are things pressing down on us and weighing on us and things that made life hard, but it hasn't ruined us. It hasn't crushed us yet. We're perplexed. Like, there's things that don't make sense. You ever feel that way when you're trying to follow Jesus? Like, God, what? Like, I thought for sure that was in your will, and you didn't answer that prayer, but then you're over here doing this, and I'm like, or God, why did you let that happen to, or, right, like, perplexed, but not despairing. Persecuted, opposed, and treated with hostility and rejected, right? Persecuted, but we're not abandoned. Struck down, literally like thrown down, like in a wrestling match or even in hand-to-hand combat in wars, this idea of struck down, like tossed down on the ground. But guess what? Not destroyed. And then he explains the perspective on all of this. His life looks like this for a good reason. Like, he's following Jesus. He has the glory of God in the face of the Christ in his earthenware jar, right? And so even though life is hard, it would be easy to cash in the chips and toss in the towel. Paul says, no, we don't do that. Here's why. Here's how Paul views his life. Verse 10, always carrying around in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Like, Paul is saying, like, it's not just that I carry Jesus in my life. It's not just I believe in him and carry him, right? It's like I'm shaping my life around him. And what did Jesus' life look like? It looked like crucifixion and resurrection. So Paul's like, in following Jesus, I'm imitating Jesus, and that means I'm living a cross-shaped kind of life. So it's not just that the content of his life is Jesus, the shape of his life is Jesus. Always carrying the dying, always laying down my life for the sake of Jesus. Always laying down my life so that not just in the words Paul speaks, but in the pattern of his life, he actually presents the glory of God in the face of Jesus. The very pattern of his life. And guess what? That means it looks inglorious. Because when God became flesh, he didn't go to a palace. He didn't come as a king. He came as a peasant in the backwaters of the Roman Empire. A people that were far off and forgotten. Paul says, look, that's my pattern. My model is to always carry the dying of Jesus so that the life of Jesus, the resurrection life, may also be revealed in our body. Then he says it 2 more times just to make sure we get the point. Verse 11 and 12, for we who live are constantly being handed over to death because of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our mortal flesh. So we're winding down and dying, and we're constantly being handed over to death and the difficulties of life, so that somehow through that the resurrection life and the resurrection power of Jesus can be manifest through us, so that hopefully people can see the glory of God in the face of Jesus through us. And then again in verse 12, so Paul says to the Corinthians, so death works in us, but life in you. Like by embodying the dying of Jesus, we're pouring the life of Jesus out into you. And that's the pattern of Paul's life. That's what Paul's life looks like. So it's not easy following Jesus. It adds to the difficulty. And yet Paul says, but guess what? I'm doing it on purpose because Jesus is my pattern, and I'm imitating him. When I was in Bible college, the president at Boise Bible College at the time was a man named Dick Ewing. When I met him, Dick was already old and approaching retirement. He was in his final years as president of Boise Bible College. And I remember sitting there in chapel at BBC for his last chapel. This was his last year. He was retiring and done. At this point, Dick had been in ministry for a long, long time. As a young man, he had moved his wife and kids to Brazil to preach Jesus in Brazil. It wasn't easy in Brazil. He would have to ride motorcycles into the backwoods of places in order to share Jesus with people back there. On one occasion, he tipped over his motorcycle and his leg hit the hot motor and, seriously singed the flesh on his leg. Number of motorcycle accidents. At one point, he had so many accidents and had so damaged his back that they had to put 2 metal rods in his back just so he could stand upright. He spent most of his adult life in his older years in constant pain. All because of trying to embody the glory of Jesus in his life, right? All because he's trying to follow Jesus. So there we sit in chapel at Boise Bible College, his final chapels. He's stepping down from any sort of formal ministry. And towards the end of his message, tears fill his eyes. His chin begins to quiver. And this is what he said. He said, "My life has been one big song of thanks and praise." He knew what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 4. He knew that he was an earthenware vessel. But he, through his vessel, was trying to carry about the dying of Jesus so that the life of Jesus could be manifest as well. And so in spite of the pain, in spite of the hardship, not just physical pain, they lost a child. He and his wife lost a child. They adopted some kids from Brazil and didn't always walk with Jesus and sometimes turned their back on him. There was emotional pain, family pain, right? Physical pain. In spite of all of that, my life has been one big song of thanks and praise. Why? Because he had the same perspective of Paul. How can you do that? How can you live that way when life hurts? How can you live that way when life is disappointing? How can you live that way when physically it hurts, right? How could Paul write these words 20 years into ministry with all that he had gone through and all that he had suffered? How could he almost have this sort of defiant joy? This resolute courage to say, no, I'm not abandoned. I may be thrown down, but I'm not destroyed, right? I may be hurting, but I'm not giving up. How could he live that way? Well, look at verse 13. He says this, having the same spirit of faith, meaning the same spirit of the faith as the psalmist he's about to quote. Having the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, I believed, therefore I spoke. It's a quote from the Psalms. Paul says, I have that same faith. I believed in God. I trusted God. What did he believe? Well, keep reading. I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believed, therefore we also speak. Here's what he believed. Knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will also raise us with Jesus and will present us together with you all. Like, how could Paul have this resolute courage in the face of opposition, hostility, difficult, rejection? How could he keep going when life was hard? How could he not lose heart? He believed. And not just generically believed, he believed that God raised Jesus from the dead. And he believed that because God raised Jesus from the dead, God would raise Paul from the dead. And God would raise the Corinthians from the dead. And so he's like, you could do what you want to my earthen vessel, but I'm going to be raised from the dead. And I want everyone to know then about Jesus. And so he says, verse 15, for all things are for your sakes, so that grace, having spread to more and more people, will cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Paul's like, I just want to do my part to spread the grace of God wherever I can, so that hopefully some people will meet Jesus, so that more people will be able to praise and thank God. That's what his life was about. And he could do that even when life was hard, because he knew that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And so he comes back in verse 16 to his point. Therefore, we don't lose heart, even when it's hard. Even when we're struck down, even when we're confused, even when we're afflicted in every way, like even when that's the case, guess what? We don't lose heart. But though our outer person is decaying, yet our inner person is being renewed day by day. Young man back here has his U.S. Marines shirt on. He's got the classic Marines line on the back of his shirt. Weakness is pain leaving the body. Which when you're 20, 21, 22, that's a great rallying cry. When you're 70, 75, 76, you start to feel like weakness is pain taking over the body. Right? And Paul's like, I know that. At this point, he's been following Jesus for 20 years. He's felt the pain. In fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he'll list off that he's been whipped. He's been beaten with lead rods on the back. He's been pummeled with stones to the point where somebody actually thought he was dead. He's been shipwrecked. It's been a night and a day in the deep, he says in 2 Corinthians 11. Like, he's had a lot of pain. His outer man is not doing so well at this point. He's got scars all over his body. In fact, early church tradition says that by the time he was older, Paul walked bow-legged because his legs had been broken so many times. I mean, he was not in good physical shape. He's not the kind of person who you would post on Instagram as an influencer because they looked so good, right? His outer man was decaying, and yet his inner man is being renewed, strengthened day by day through the Spirit of Jesus within him. He goes on in verse 17, he says, for our, catch this, momentary light affliction. I just listed off just a few of the things he mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11, not even all of it. It's heavier than most things I've ever carried. I've never been whipped 39 times, like 39 lashes. 3 times, he says in 2 Corinthians 11. Like half-inch lead rods beaten on your back. Like, never had that experienced. Like, you know, my biggest problems are things like financial or relational. I haven't had nearly the physical things that he's gone through, as well as the relational things. He's dealing with a church at this point that had rejected him, and he's trying to win them back. He planted the church, and they rejected him. Some church planters know how that goes. Momentary light affliction, he says, is producing for us an eternal weight of glory that's far beyond all comparison. It's a picture of a balance scale, right? How much meat are you buying? Well, we'll put the meat you want on this side, and we'll pile up the weights on the other side, and when it's balanced, okay, that is, a pound of meat, right? That's the picture he's using, and what he's saying is all the hardship we experience in life on one, however much it is, you pile it up on one side, and it might seem like a lot, but then when you get over here, and you're going to put all the glory that God is preparing for his people, and you start piling that on and piling that on, there's no comparison. Like the weight of glory exceeds any trouble we would ever experience in life. And that's why Paul does not lose heart. That's why he keeps going. Because Paul has this remarkable ability to see what lies ahead. And he stays focused on that, and he keeps going. And so he says in verse 18, while we look, like fixing our eyes, looking at, this is what he's doing. He keeps going. He doesn't lose heart because he's not looking at all the stuff around him and all the suffering hardship. He's looking at the things not which are seen, but the things which are unseen. The things that haven't become reality yet. The things God is preparing for his people that haven't materialized just yet, but they're just around the corner when God decides it's time, and he produces a new heavens and a new earth, and he raises his people and gives them glorified bodies. In that moment, In that moment, Paul says, yeah, at that point, our afflictions will seem like hardly anything. As Mother Teresa once said, compared to the glory God is preparing for us, the afflictions of life on earth seems like one bad night in a cheap hotel. God's got a whole lot more in store for his people. And so Paul fixes his eyes on that, and the reason for that is because the things that are seen, the things that we can see right now, they're temporary. But the things which are not seen, they're eternal. They will last forever. Why is it that Paul could go about life and not lose heart? What will help us go about life and through whatever difficulties we encounter and not give up and not lose heart? What is it? It's fixing our eyes on the things that are not seen, on the things that God is preparing. It's our hope, the weight of glory that God has prepared for us in the future. Yes, life is hard, right? My grandson, Wes, he thinks getting tennis shoes might be hard now, but there's going to be a whole lot harder things Wes is going to have to face. Those of us who have lived life and we're looking at our grandkids, right? Sometimes it's hard to think, man, like, they seem so sweet, they seem so innocent, and getting your tennis shoes seems hard, but I know if you live any length of life, you're going to face difficulty. You will too, like Paul, be afflicted in various ways. You will experience heartache and disappointment. It's going to happen. You'll be tempted to just toss in the towel and say, screw it all, forget it. Right? What's going to keep you strong and help you to go the distance? It's not how impressive you are. It's not how wonderful you are. It's not how smart you are. It's how wonderful Jesus is and the glory that God is preparing for us through him. A couple years ago, me and elders from the church I was pastoring at the time received an invitation to come and pray with a gal named Lori. If we could put Lori's picture up on the screen. This is Lori. I'd known Lori at this point for 10, 12 years when we got this call, and Lori was facing, I think it was her third bout of breast cancer, and the prognosis was not good. So me, a couple other pastors, and some of the elders from the church, we were sitting in a circle with Lori and her husband, Steve. Steve himself is an orthopedic surgeon, right? They're connected to the medical community. At the time this happened, Lori's son was about ready to graduate high school. Her daughter was just a few months away from getting married. We're sitting there with Steve and Lori, and this is what Lori said. Not forced, not artificial, completely genuine. Lori says, I want you guys to pray that if it's the Lord's will, he would heal me. But I want you to pray that if it's his will, he would heal me. Because the way I see it, I can't lose. Like, do you want to be there for your son's high school graduation? Do you want to be there to watch your only daughter get married? This is what she's facing. But the way I see it, I can't lose. Because if the Lord hears our prayers and decides to heal me, I get to be there for those events. But if he doesn't, if he should choose not to, then I get to go be with Jesus. And so either way, I win. That's what she said. Either way, I win. She thinks like Paul. She thinks like Paul. And that's why she has left an impression on so many people, not just from the way she died, but for the way she lived. Because she lived knowing that she was merely an earthenware jar. But she carried the glory of God in the face of Jesus. And whatever happened in life, she could not lose. And that's what's going to help you and help me be faithful disciples from now until the final day, whenever it should come.